Welcome to Feminism and Its Discontents. I'm Cecily Fia-Fernandez. This series is an opportunity to present ideas that challenge the orthodoxy of the feminist movement, with women whose views are often ignored by the mainstream media. The first episode features British writer Mary Harrington. Mary is a contributing editor at the UK current affairs magazine Unheard and has been published in numerous journals, including The Times and the Mail on Sunday. Her forthcoming book, Feminism Against Progress, addresses the threat AI and biotech pose to women. You can find her on Substack under Reactionary Feminist. We begin the first part of our discussion with a look at how industrialization gave rise to the first wave of feminism, and the division that existed even in the movement's infancy between two distinct models of feminism.
So as we moved from the Middle Ages into industrial society, that forced certain very, very significant material changes to the way people organized themselves in families. For example, work no longer happened predominantly in the home as it had done in the Middle Ages or in early pre-revolutionary, I suppose, America, where most of social life there was still agrarian. And women under those circumstances worked alongside men, although the roles were quite distinct, they were quite gendered. Women's work was women's work and men's work was men's work, but everybody worked in a very interdependent way to sustain the family, the basic unit of social life, which was families. And people didn't think of themselves really as individuals so much as households, or at least that's the way the political order was structured. And the political and democracy under those circumstances was set up to reflect that. So the head of any given household had the democratic voice. It wasn't a case of every individual within that household having an equal vote. It was structured so that the basic unit of political life was a household. So that's way back then.
What are you talking about as far as years?
Mid 18th century in America, mid 17th century, even 16th century in the UK, industrialization has started about a century, if I remember rightly, earlier in Britain than it did in the United States. I think something well over half of American families at the beginning of the 18th century were agrarian, and by the end that was a fraction. Right. So it all happened very fast, and that absolutely radically transformed how people lived in families.
It's almost like each family was a family business.
Yes, yes, I think that's a very good way of describing it.
You can see how you could be a woman living, at that time without feeling that you don't have rights, feeling that you're contributing in a very important way.
I think it's more that rights are kind of neither here nor there from the point of view of a busy housewife living in the middle of nowhere, in a pioneer situation. It's just not really front and center when right. Actually what needs to happen is the production of basic subsistence goods in order for your family not to die of hunger or cold next winter. Right. It's a completely different, you're just not really thinking about who gets to vote, because that's just not a priority.
Right.
But what happened under industrialization, particularly for bourgeois women, was that they inherited that political order, so that legacy political order stayed in place. So women had no legal personhood, limited rights to own property, limited rights to their children, etc., and so on. But they also lost economic agency in the industrial model, because suddenly they weren't productive members of an interdependent household anymore. They were much less economically active, and suddenly their role was about educating children, tending to the home. It was much more consumption than production oriented, and so in a sense that's fine, as long as you like your husband and your husband likes you and he's a responsible guy and you have enough funds. But what happens if that's not the case? So, not without reason, women at that point started to agitate for a greater recognition of women's role in the home. They all started agitating for political agency and their own rights. They started agitating for the right to own property. But what I find really interesting about the 19th century women's movement is that you can see already taking shape in that movement the two poles, as I see, of the feminist movement, which on the one side is a desire to see care and dependency and the needs of dependent children and the old and so on valued and respected and appreciated as being, of central social importance. And on the other, you start seeing this campaign for rights and individual autonomy, and unencumbered political freedom. And these two things are really in tension, as you can see. And as I delved into the research for Feminism Against Progress, I originally thought that this was a split which happened in the 20th century, but it's not. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the women's movement, which is to say it goes all the way back to the beginning of the industrial era, this tension between dependency and freedom.
I guess I would think of, really first wave feminism as really, the early 1900s. We tend to think of women as just getting, stronger and bolder as the years go by. And, it's surprising just how aggressive and bold these women were. Can you kind of describe how they were thought of, at least in Britain, and how the movement was perceived kind of by society at large?
People have very mixed feelings about the suffragettes. They were, it goes back into the 19th century as well. On the one hand, they were laughed at. They were caricatured in the newspapers of, progressive women in their bloomers riding bicycles and, turning vegetarian and espousing all sorts of silly ideas and generally corrupting the servants and misbehaving, throwing themselves under racehorses. And on the other hand, people very seriously debated their propositions, and it was an enormously divisive issue. It didn't, and I think it was it 1920 women got the vote? It was after the First World War.
1920 in the US, I think 1918 maybe in
right. And you can, one can argue that it was less about sort of moral recognition that in fact women ought to have the vote than it was about an important economic constituency which suddenly came into play after the loss of an enormous number of men after World War I. It depends how cynical you want to be in terms of how you want to read that. But it was, the first wave, it was enormously controversial. It was enormously controversial, and there were plenty of caricatures of those women.
And do you think these women, after the war, after they had won the right to vote, do you think that the kind of first wave feminists felt that, okay, we've achieved this and the movement is kind of over, or that we've done, they're satisfied with what they had achieved?
I honestly don't know what the suffragettes themselves thought, whether they thought that it was that they completed their work. I know certainly that Eleanor Rathbone, who was a prominent voice in the feminist movement, did not stop thinking about the condition of women, and was, from a modern point of view, not even particularly liberal in her views on how that should work. In 1917, she wrote an essay, which a very interesting essay called "On the Remuneration of Women," in which she argued essentially that the government should pay women to stay home because it was of national importance. That the next generation of fine upstanding British citizens ought to be properly raised, and not, and furthermore that sending women off to work in factories and so on and so forth would depress wages for men and throw the entire ecosystem of family wages out of joint, which from a 21st century feminist point of view is a pretty heretical argument to make. But in 1917, from where she was sitting, she was making the case not just for women but for families as well. So it's a much richer and more textured debate than it sometimes seems from a present day perspective. One of my frustrations actually with the sort of pop feminism, if you like, is just how heavily it's dominated by a sort of Marxian analysis, which sees things very much in terms of property relations and patriarchy and so on, and also the extent to which its past debates tend to get whitewashed by present preoccupations. So every generation of feminists seems to consign the previous one to the bin, and being a kind of I'm a conservative. I think we should respect tradition, which means we should take seriously the feminist theorists of the past, including the ones that don't fit our contemporary preoccupations.
What do you think is important about this time?
Well, I think they, in a sense, I mean, my framework for understanding this is to, I suppose, to look at it through the. I mean, I see the if you like, the liberating, the freedom oriented pole of these two feminist poles. So on the one hand, you have a kind of care feminism, and on the other hand, you have a sort of feminism of freedom. And these are the two poles that go all the way back to the beginning of the women's movement. And the feminism of freedom, if you like, has consistently defeated throughout the history of the women's movement the feminism of care. And is the question for me why that continues being the case is an open one. I think it's a very interesting one. I don't have a well worked out answer to it, but it keeps happening. And in every age of the feminist era, there are women who stand up and say, well, what about the kids? And then in every feminist era, there are women who say, well, no, but we want to be freer.
Right.
And that takes slightly different forms depending on the material conditions. So in the 19th century, that was about property and it was about the vote. In the early 20th century, so if you like, after World War I, but into up to the 1960s, that was about, and beyond the 1960s, that was about entry into the workplace. Mm-hmm. And then once the contraceptive pill became available, it was about sexual freedom.
Right.
And in every one of those eras, there have been women saying, actually, relationships and interdependence and the needs of dependent others are important to us too. And in every age, there's also been these voices saying, well, no, actually, we're just mostly interested in being even freer. Yes. But this is a very textured debate, and it's been present from the word go.
Coming up, we move beyond first-wave feminism to explore how the post-war baby boom gave rise to the idealized image of the perfect suburban housewife, and how that image was shattered in dramatic fashion with the second wave of feminism, sparked in part by Betty Friedan's landmark book, The Feminine Mystique. From there, we take on the abortion issue and why it remains at the core of the movement as the ultimate expression of the divide between dependency and autonomy.
We have this picture of, the perfect 1950s housewife who was probably a thing, and chances are some of them were very happy. But there was also a very intense debate going on about whether women should actually still be doing the work. A lot of women were in employment during the war, and who were then quite forcefully kicked out of those jobs, right, and back into home again when men came back from the war. And so there was quite a lot of conflict between the sexes going on. And a sort of contest over what was everybody's proper domain.
And it's a really fascinating time, especially when you look at, when you consider like the 1940s, and when there were a lot of women who did need to go into industry because, so many men were off fighting the war. At least in Hollywood, there was this, there were all these very strong, iconic movie stars like Joan Crawford and
right,
Betty.
But then you get Rosie the Riveter and iconic images like that.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden she's meant to go back into her box again.
Right. And then you have the 50s. I always contrast that with, well, I think, I don't know if you ever watched Mad Men, but the character of Betty Draper kind of seems to really, symbolize that kind of like discontent and being, a housewife with very limited options, and with the feminine mystique and when that kind of burst on the scene, what kind of impact do you think that had? I mean, obviously in the US anyway, that was part of this huge revolution, in the along with the pill, but certainly that book that really captured these feelings, and I'm sure for women, all of their frustration with being housewives and not having opportunities and being forced back into the home. What do you think about that book and its impact?
I mean, it was hugely influential at the time. It seems to have inspired a lot of women to try and change their lives. Certainly, again, amongst the kind of bourgeois women who were living that kind of somewhat alienated suburban existence, where their principal role in life was to be the linchpin for everybody else and to operate consumer products. I mean, that's Ivan Illich's reading of what women's work became under consumer society. So instead of having an active, productive life in an interdependent household, in a sense, your job is now just to operate consumer products. You buy a vacuum cleaner, but it doesn't actually do anything until you operate it. You buy products from elsewhere and then you put them together, and that's your work. And that's all there is to it. And that was really what Betty Friedan was complaining about. She was saying, this just isn't enough. And she was very clear that for her, family was important. She didn't say that women should cast off. She wasn't embracing the sort of full Marxist family abolition perspective on women's liberation. As far as she was concerned, the aim was to find some sort of a settlement where fulfilling life was possible in addition to enjoying raising your kids.
I think that perhaps was her aim, but I think, at least for me as a child of the 70s, with a feminist mom, I do think that this idea that somehow that kind of motherhood was really not enough, and that kind of this idea that if you were to just be a mother, that was really looked down upon. Just how I think women in the 50s probably felt like there were so many options that weren't available to them, so many avenues that weren't available to them. As somebody who grew up in the 70s, I felt that being a stay-at-home mom was not an option for me.
Yeah, maybe that's... I had a very similar, but I internalized a very similar set of ideas. I mean, I was born in the late 70s. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. She didn't love it, but I did a stint as a stay-at-home mom. I kind of fell off the edge of the working world after I had a baby, and I found it's quite a nice life. But I also experienced firsthand that thing every stay-at-home mom has experienced, when you're at a party and somebody says, "Oh, what do you do?" and you tell them, and they make their excuses and go and talk to someone else. And that just happens on a regular basis. If you prioritize caring as a working age adult of average intelligence, and who could theoretically be doing something else, everyone just writes you off as probably a bit stupid, probably a bit boring, and generally as a second-rate human. Yeah. And that's just a completely routine experience that I think every stay-at-home mom has had.
And I think that's an issue and a problem. I mean, I think that kind of came to the forefront a little bit. I think in the 90s, Hillary Clinton made this famous comment about, well, I'm not going to stay home and bake cookies and have teas. And I remember thinking, this was before I had kids, but I remember thinking, that sounds great. But just this kind of derisive attitude towards...
Right. My friend Erica Bakayocki published a book last year. If you like, it's a sort of conservative re-examination of the early history of feminism from Mary Wollstonecraft. And her argument is that if you like, the two the feminism of freedom and the feminism of care, are there in tension from the word go. The sort of valorization of family life and the sort of urge to break free and head west. I'm paraphrasing her wildly here, but this is she traces the contours of those two poles from the 19th. From the early ages, the early feminist movement. And her argument is that the feminism of freedom won conclusively in was it 1972 that abortion was legalized?
73.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And because if you're pegging personhood and an ability to participate in society to the ability to rid yourself of the most vulnerable dependent other that there is, i.e., the child that can't survive outside your body, then you're making a very clear statement that freedom is more important to you than dependency. I don't think it's possible to make.
Certainly see that. Here in the U.S., the abortion issue is so central to the feminist movement. And it seems to be the issue that really inspires women the most, at least I would say on the left.
Shut it down! If we don't get them, shut it down! When women's rights are under attack, what do we do? Stand up, fight back! What do we do?
To me, it seems in the women's movement kind of takes up all the space, to a certain extent. It's hard for there to be room for much else because it's such an emotional issue, such a divisive issue, and such a political issue.
It is. I think it doesn't get much more fundamental to a project that's based on individual freedom than the freedom to do or not, or the freedom or not to do as you wish with your own body. But I mean, to me, it's a conceptual. It's a very challenging issue. I found Erica's book very challenging. I've always been just reflexively in the safe, legal, and rare camp when it came to terminating pregnancies. It wasn't something I'd given a great deal of thought to, but I've been reflecting for some years, actually since my daughter was born, and since experiencing being just invisible as a stay-at-home mum, and thinking a great deal about the relationship between dependency and motherhood and freedom and all of this, reading and thinking and just living fairly deeply into all of these questions. It hit very hard for me to read her argument that in fact it's not possible to make a coherent case for a feminism of care whilst also upholding without question the right to terminate pregnancy, because in a sense you've already conceded 99% of the argument at that point. Now, what that would mean in policy terms, I don't yet know. And if we were to take the women's movement in a different direction, then to have already conceded 99% of the argument about how to balance care against independence. But to me, the question of abortion is absolutely the nuclear core of that, and the reason the reason there's such fierce resistance to touching it, and particularly in a country that's so sort of deeply culturally wedded to the idea of freedom as the United States. And I think that's probably part of the reason why it's as radioactive as it is in the United States, because that's such a central part of who you are as a polity, this question of freedom, to a far greater extent, I think, than in Britain, or at least we have a different relationship to it. Anyway, I mean, but it really is the nuclear core of the question of how we weigh questions of dependency and relationship against the value of individual autonomy, and where we situate that. And when we're talking about what's happening inside my actual body, I mean, it doesn't get much more personal than that. So of course it's radioactive. But I don't see how we cannot reopen that question if we're to effect any kind of a reconciliation.
I don't know. I find that while there's a lot of passion around the abortion issue, I don't feel there's not much conversation really about abortion. There aren't really women who talk openly about all of the more intimate feelings about abortion. It's really just a black and white issue in America. Either you're pro-choice or pro-life. And it's sad to me that, because of this issue dominates so much, that it really prevents women from coming together on other issues. And
I mean, it's an open question for me whether or not there actually is I'm not sure. I'm not even sure that there is a compromise. I mean, some disagreements are very difficult to resolve by rational debate because they're based on such different premises. And right. I mean, if you ask a question like, do you or do you not think personhood is based on an absolute right to remodel your body as you see fit, which is really what the abortion question says. Do I have the right to do whatever I want to my own body, or are there some limits to that? Then there is. I'm not sure there really. It's difficult to find a compromise position. I mean, in practice, when it comes to remodeling our bodies, we do impose limits, still somewhat on people's right, if you like, to do that. But do we have the right to end the beginning of a new life in order to exert control of our own body? I'm not sure. You're either pregnant or you're not. So in a sense, because that's as binary as it is. The question of whether or not you have the right to make yourself not pregnant if you are is fairly binary as well. And I'm not sure that I certainly don't think that it's one that we're going to be able to resolve from within a rights framework.
Mm-hmm.
Because fundamentally what it's about is what the rights framework leaves out, which is to say dependency and relationship and all those ways of being a person which are not quite one person and not quite two people, which I think, it's something which mothers are more likely to be able to understand intuitively than people in general, for the simple reason that, if you felt a child moving inside you, and that child isn't able to survive outside you, that they're not you, because they get hiccups or they kick you in the ribs from the inside or whatever. But they're also kind of you as well. And I remember that feeling of being merged with my daughter actually went on for a long time after she was born.
And I think, and a lot of mothers experience this, but I just feel that these kind of nuanced conversations, these are just a kind of thoughts that I think for a lot of women who are very strongly pro-choice, they just really don't want to have, because I think for them there's such an emotional component that it's an attack on, there's a lot of fear, I think, associated with when you see women who are protesting and, they're talking about, Roe v. Wade and the potential for, if that were to be repealed, it's this very visceral reaction. And it seems like for them, it's life or death. So it just seems impossible to have these kind of conversations.
If you've internalized the idea that personhood is not possible unless you have complete control over your own body and
Yes.
are able to be unencumbered if you want to be. If those are your core assumptions about what a person is, then of course you're going to fight to the death for the right to not be interdependent and to not grow symbiotes against your will, if you like.
And that gets back to the point you were mentioning before about the writer. You said that this concept of individual freedom, I forget how you phrased it, has won. And I do think you see that in the feminist movement today, that has won, because that's just so radioactive. And if you question that, there's really no room for you.
Yeah, I think it's no coincidence that it was really after the legalization of contraception and abortion that the women's movement more or less abandoned, or at least mainstream feminism more or less abandoned the question of how men and women ought to live together, and began taking what I think of as a much more radical, various sort of somewhat more radical forms, which are to do with sort of, if you like, absolute individual freedom,
right,
or female separatism, or perhaps the victory of one sex over another. And in a sense, the entire increasingly bitter dispute that's now well advanced between the sexes is happening in the wake of that absolutely fundamental hinge moment in the mid-20th century, where women basically cut loose. We legalized a biomedical intervention which enabled us for the first time ever to cut loose from interdependence with men.
In the final part of our discussion, we examine some of the controversial issues that reflect a radical shift in the dogma of the women's movement, from a reflexive belief in oppressive patriarchy to gender ideology, which imagines that men and women are interchangeable.
I'm always, fascinated when I talk to young women who, are attending a good college, and they have parents who have always been supportive, fathers who have, sacrificed to make sure that they could go to a good school, and they've been encouraged to really pursue anything they want. And they really, though, believe that they are, living in an oppressive patriarchy. And I'm always struck by that, given, just how many opportunities they have and the lives they lead. I always think this has got to be the worst patriarchy ever, because
This is rubbish. It's a rubbish patriarchy. Very inept patriarchy as these things go. I don't know. I think
these are really...
I read on to that question. I recently read an interesting and also very frustrating history of women and medicine called Unwell Women, if anybody wants to be intensely irritated for 500 pages, by Eleanor Rathbone. Interesting stuff in it, and strange narrative. I mean, the very top line is she sees the history of women and medicine as, more or less evidence of the eternal patriarchal animus. But what came through and there's plenty of evidence of male doctors being, really not getting women, that goes way back. There are plenty, there's no shortage of evidence of men, male medics just really having no idea what to do with women. But what came through for me from her history of that, which is, there's plenty of evidence for it, wasn't so much that patriarchy just keeps on coming back, as that no matter what we do and no matter how hard we try and level the playing field between men and women, there are some asymmetries between the sexes which are just irreducible. And my sense of what's going on for these young women who get to college and then discover that actually they aren't just interchangeable units with their male male colleagues and their male friends, is that they're discovering reluctantly that in fact they're still female and their male friends are still male, and that has implications whether they like it or not. And having internalized from the word go, I imagine these women were not even born when Hillary was cracking her jokes about being just a mother. Most women who are at college age now have internalized from the word go the idea that there are no substantial differences between men and women, apart from some very superficial features of our bodies, and even those, according to the latest orthodoxy, are fairly interchangeable. We kind of meet Lego and we can reorganize ourselves as we wish. But fundamentally, the belief is that there are no substantial differences between men and women, and that goes all the way back to the second wave, really. I mean, Germaine Greer argued that all the psychological differences between so-called natural differences between men and women were really just products of stereotype, and that and we've been working on that assumption for best for half a century now. It's my view that the truth is a bit more complicated than that.
Well, certainly, and right. There are still some of us who, and I think this is another, one of these major fault lines, is that there are a lot of people, and I put myself in this category, that, I really embrace the gender differences. I find them interesting, and that was just something, I accepted early on. And I think probably, things come in waves. I think for me, having a mother who was a feminist, who kind of rejected a lot of those traditional ideas, I just naturally gravitated toward them. And, so, sometimes I do think there's, these generational shifts. And I wonder how, as the women feminists have gone so radical, what, I always wonder, I wonder what their daughters will be like, because I see myself, I might've been an exception, but when you grow up in an environment where those kind of traditional values are thrown out the window, at least for me, I had a great appreciation for them. And, I don't know how many women today or young women would sympathize with this, but I really embrace gender differences. And, I think they kind of make life, valuable to a great extent. And that's just so, that's just such a problematic view of things. And again, I think that, that's another area within the feminist movement that is very hard to find common ground for those of us who believe that there are important gender differences, and that the idea that we're men and women are the same is not something you would want.
I mean, in terms of what the next generation or the one after that thinks about all of this, I think my take on that is that a great deal depends on what happens in the wider world, which is to say, if the whole world carries on getting richer, more peaceful, more high tech, more materially abundant, and so on, then we'll be able to go on pretending that there are no meaningful differences between men and women. Or for those sections of the world which keep on going in that direction, you know, the orthodoxy will probably go on being that there are no meaningful differences between men and women. You know, should on the other hand, you know, in the event that things get less peaceful, more dangerous, you know, the more scarce in terms of resources, more hardscrabble in terms of what you have to do in order to get your food. You know, under those circumstances, I think it will take less than a generation for the kind of sex roles that we saw in the pre-industrial world to re-emerge. You know, because they have to, because fundamentally men and women are not the same. And, you know, when it comes to survival, there are just some things, you know, things just become more straightforwardly sexed and nobody really worries about it too much. So I think a lot depends on whether or not we're facing an apocalypse or not. If we are, then, you know, we'll have, you know, men and women will be back with a vengeance. If
That's
we are,
kind of a tough choice for me. I'm not sure. You know, so for me, right,
so you can have men and women again, but you have to have an apocalypse.
Well, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I know you only have like a minute, but I would like you to just tell me a little bit about, for people who are interested in your book, Feminism Against Progress. I think it will be coming out. I'm not sure when, but tell me a little bit about that book, because I know you touched on some of the subjects already.
Yeah, I've touched on a number of themes from the book. I want to look at the women's movement as it emerged as an effect of the industrial era. And I want to start from this premise that where we are now has seen the pretty conclusive defeat of the feminism of care by the feminism of freedom. And I'll spend some time looking at the changes which have fallen out of that. I attribute to that much of the sexual revolution, which has pros and cons, as I think most conservatives will say, and also the decline of marriage, the decline of fertility. You know, the now absolutely catastrophically collapsing birth rate across the West, I think is very much connected to, although in quite a complex way, with the feminism of freedom and the technologies which enable that. And I want to look ahead a bit at the biotech age, because it's my theory that if feminism was really the women's way of trying to ensure a just settlement for our sex under the industrial era, we're now leaving the industrial era for something new, which I think of as the cyborg age, which is much more, you know, it's highly digital. You know, in a sense, we've accepted the idea that we can use technology to master any and all human and ecological limits. And I have some questions about whether or not that's true. And I see some dystopian aspects to that emerging. Which have significant implications for feminism and are actually being spearheaded by something which now calls itself feminism, but which I think of as something more like biolibertarianism, which is to say a movement which argues in the name of women that we should just be able to defeat any and we should just be able to master our own bodies, you know, in every possible way, remodel them if we like, you know, have absolute control over every aspect of our own physiologies, down to reproduction, down to, you know, growing babies in vats if we want to, down to gestational surrogacy. A number, and the implications of that biolibertarian movement I see as being very significant for women, and by no means all good, even though much of it is delivered in the name of feminism. And then I want to look ahead at where I think we ought to go instead of that.
Okay, yeah, let's end on something positive.
I mean, I'm staying fairly stum about what I think we should do about all of it, but I have the last third of the book will be what I call reactionary feminism, which is to say, you know, what I see as a pro-women movement, what a pro-women movement looks like, not in the industrial age, but in the cyborg age. So I'll have plenty more to say about that when the book comes out. I'm really excited about writing it. I'm going to get burned at the stake, but it's going to be fun.
Thanks so much for watching the first episode of Feminism and Its Discontents. I'd love to get your feedback and suggestions for upcoming episodes. You can contact me directly and get updates on the series at First Hand Media DC. I'm Cecily Fia Fernandez, and I encourage you to join the conversation. See you next time.